I recently did a video titled, "Where Have All the 35mm single lens reflex cameras gone?" And I got a lot of response to that video. And one of the comments I received was from a gentleman who said, "I'd love to see a similar video on medium format cameras." So in this edition of Jules Voto's Photo Focus, I'm going to look back at 1970, 1971, and talk about some of the single lens reflex medium format cameras that were available back then. So we're going to start with the Bronica S2A. Bronica S2A was a 2¼ square single lens reflex with a focal plane shutter. It had interchangeable film backs, an instant return mirror. It used Nikkor lenses. The basic camera came with a 75mm 2.8 Nikkor, a 120/220 back. So with the Bronica, you could use either 120 or 220 in the same backs, unlike some other medium format SLRs. And it listed for $549.50. And lenses were available from 40mm to 600mm. Now, before we continue with the next camera, if you enjoy videos like this on classic cameras, medium format, 35mm, and their lenses, please subscribe to my channel and like this video. So I got most of this information from this 1971 Popular Photography Directory and Buying Guide. And that's where I got the information from the previous video on 35mm cameras. And this has been around. I bought this in 1970. And so it's kind of falling apart, but it has a lot of good information in it. So the next camera we're going to talk about is the Hasselblad 500C. Now, this book was published in late 1970. I believe the 500CM was available by that time. However, there's no mention of it in this directory and buying guide. So we're just going to go with the 500C. So the Hasselblad 500C was also a 2¼ square single lens reflex camera. However, it did not have a focal plane shutter. Each lens had its own shutter. So leaf shutters built into each lens. They were Zeiss lenses, excellent line of lenses. It took interchangeable film backs. However, with the Hasselblad, if you wanted to use 120 film, you needed an A12 back, which 12 exposures on 120 film. And if you wanted to shoot 220 film, you would have needed an A24 back, 24 exposures on 220 film. It had interchangeable finders. However, the 500C did not have interchangeable screens. The 500CM did. The Hasselblad had lenses available from 40mm to 500mm, and it sold for $750. Again, these are list prices. You can get them cheaper. I worked in a camera store starting in 1973. It was a Photolab camera store, and I remember us having the 500C with the 80mm 2.8 planner and an A12 magazine for $550. Now, by 1973, of course, the 500CM was out. It could have been that we had some old stock of 500Cs. I really don't remember, but I do remember that price of $550. The next camera we're going to talk about is the Hasselblad 500EL. The EL is basically a 500C with a motor attached on the bottom. And it took rechargeable NiCad batteries. And you could also use a 70 exposure back with that camera using 70mm film, and you got 70 2¼ square pictures. That is basically the camera that went to the moon. Modified, of course, for use by the astronauts, but it was basically a Hasselblad 500EL. And the EL with 80mm 2.8 planar, and an 812 magazine sold for $990. Again, I keep saying sold, but that was the list price. You could buy the body only for $525. Next is another 2¼ square SLR with leaf shutter lenses, and that is the Kowa SIX. It was called the poor man's Hasselblad. With an 85mm 2.8 lens and waist level finder, it sold for $349.50. It also had interchangeable finders and screens. It had lenses ranging from 40mm to 250mm. It did not have interchangeable backs, but you could use 120 or 220. It did not have an instant return mirror. And I don't know if I mentioned that with the Hasselblad, but the Hasselblad did not have an instant return mirror. When you advance the film, when you turn the crank to advance the film and cock the shutter, the mirror drops back down. Should have mentioned that with the Hasselblad. But that was, I shot Hasselblad for weddings. That was never an issue for me. You took the shot, you wound the film, and the mirror would drop. So it really wasn't a problem. It wasn't a camera you would use for action. You wouldn't shoot sports with it. You wouldn't shoot birds in flight, for example. But it was an excellent camera, as all these medium format SLRs are. Back in the 60s and well into the 70s and even the 80s, the medium format SLR was the camera of choice for many wedding photographers, studio photographers, portrait photographers. They were very popular, but also very expensive compared to 35mm cameras for the most part. Next, we're going to talk about a camera that was introduced in 1970, the Mamiya RB67. And RB stands for revolving back. Now, so far, the cameras I have talked about shot 2¼ square images on 120 or 220 film. The Mamiya also used 120 or 220 film, but it produced a 2¼ by 2¾ negative, which they called the ideal format because it scaled right up to 8x10 without any cropping. So the Mamiya also had a built-in bellows, so you could focus really close, and it also took leaf shutter lenses with speeds from 1 to 1/400th of a second. And another thing I forgot to mention is that with a leaf shutter, you could synchronize flash at all speeds. So that was the nice thing when I shot weddings with the Hasselblad. If I'm using fill flash outdoors for portraits, which I did quite a bit, you could sync your flash up to a 500th of a second, where many 35mm SLRs back then, the fastest sync speed was 1/125th of a second. There were lenses available from 65 to 250mm. That's when the camera was first introduced in 1970. Of course, that lens line expanded as time went on. But one of the nicest things about that camera was the revolving back. So if you wanted to shoot horizontal, you turned the back to horizontal. If you wanted to shoot a vertical shot, you just turn the back on the camera. And you didn't have to turn the camera to shoot a vertical. So that was a real nice feature of that camera. It was slower to operate, and it was heavier than most of the other medium format SLRs at the time, probably was the heaviest. And it had a separate lever to cock the shutter and wind the film. Whereas with these other cameras I've talked about so far, it was usually just a crank or a knob. You just turn that, it cocked the shutter, dropped the mirror back down, and advanced the film. With the Mamiya, it was a separate operation, and once you cocked the shutter and wound the film, the mirror would drop back down. So it also did not have an instant return mirror. All these cameras with leaf shutters did not have instant return mirrors. And the Mamiya RB with 90mm 3.8 lens and a film back sold for $549.50. Next, we're going to talk about a camera from the Soviet Union, the Praktica 66. It looked like a 35mm SLR, only larger. It had a focal plane shutter. It had interchangeable finders and screens. Lenses were available from 50 to 500 millimeters. It did not have an instant return mirror. You see it had the front mounted shutter release like the Praktica 35 millimeter cameras. It was $299.95 with waist level finder and $349.95 with a prism. And it took 120 or 220 film and produced a 2 1/4 square negative. Now, the Pentacon 6 looked identical, just a different name. I'm not sure if they were probably made in different factories. Next, we're going to have another camera that looked like a scaled up 35 millimeter, and it was introduced in 1970, and that's the Pentax 6x7. It came standard with the pentaprism and 105 millimeter 2.4 lens. It made 10 exposures on 120 film and 11 on 220, so they're able to squeeze out an extra frame there. Had lenses available from 35 millimeter to 1,000 millimeters. It had a focal plane shutter with speeds from 1 to 1/1000th of a second. And the 6x7 had a list price of $895.95. One of the issues with these medium format cameras that had focal plane shutters was the sync speed. The Pentax synced with flash at 1/30th of a second. Now, they did make several lenses with leaf shutters for the Pentax. I believe there were 2 of them. Next, we're going to talk about the most expensive camera of the cameras in this video, and that is the Rollei SL66. It was a camera that produced 2 1/4 square images on either 120 or 220 film, 12 exposures on 120, 24 on 220. It had a focal plane shutter, speeds from 1 to 1/1000th of a second, an instant return mirror. It used Zeiss lenses like the Hasselblad. Of course, these did not have the shutter built in, although there was some lenses for the Rolleiflex that did have a leaf shutter. The standard configuration was the waist level finder with the 80 millimeter 2.8 planar. This camera also had a built-in bellows, which enabled you to focus very close with the 80 millimeter lens, like just under 5 inches. It also had a tilting front, which you could use in certain situations to increase depth of field. It listed for $1,350. And I remember an ad for the SL66 back then that said the most expensive, I don't know the exact words, but the most expensive medium format single lens reflex. But damn the cost. No other camera can touch it. And it did have that useful feature of the bellows, built-in bellows, to enable you to focus in close, where with most of the other cameras other than the RB, you needed to add extension tubes to get close. But it was bigger than a Hasselblad and heavier. And it was an excellent camera, used the excellent Zeiss lenses, but it was almost double the price of the Hasselblad. And finally, we're going to talk about another camera made in the USSR, the Zenith 80. It looked like one of the original Hasselblads. Now, Hasselblad first cameras were introduced, I believe, in 1947, the 1600, I believe it was, and it had a focal plane shutter. Well, this camera is really a copy of that camera. It came with an 80 millimeter lens, had a focal plane shutter, speeds from 1/2 to 1/1000th of a second, no instant return mirror, shot 2 1/4 square images, and I believe you could have used the lenses for the Hasselblad 1600, those early Hasselblads, on this camera. And it sold for $375 with a 120 back and with the 80mm lens. So back then in 1970, 1971, and continuing, these were the cameras of choice for wedding, portrait, and studio photographers. And they produced a much larger negative than a 35mm camera, which gave you more options for cropping and producing large prints. And if you have shot with a medium format camera, if you currently shoot with one, if you're shooting film, leave your comments in the comments below. Let me know about your experience. What was your choice? What camera did you shoot with? Now, there were also twin lens reflex cameras. They weren't as popular by this time. Their popularity was fading as the SLR took over. But I plan on doing a video on the TLRs of that time. So leave your comments in the comments below, your questions, your comments, and I always try to respond to all questions and comments. And if you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel. I usually publish a new video every Monday morning and Wednesday morning at 11 a.m. Eastern Time. So thanks for watching, and I will talk to you then.